Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Robbins, the Senior Curator at Leighton House, and I'm delighted to welcome you all this evening. A wonderful number of you joining us for this evening's talk. Of course, anybody who knows anything about Leighton House will know of the wonderful contribution made to it by William de Morgan and the tiles that were created and displayed on the ground floor of the house. Those associations actually continued after the house had become a museum. In fact, at one point, the collection, the de Morgan Foundation collection, was largely housed at Leighton House. That all ended rather controversially, and I know Sarah has dug into the circumstances around that period in the history of the museum. So I look forward to hearing about that. So I'm delighted to welcome Sarah. We worked with Sarah recently on the review of our collection of de Morgan and, if you like, post-de Morgan holdings. Sarah read art history at Durham University and completed her MA at the University of Manchester before beginning her career in museums at the National Gallery. She has worked in exhibition management, curation and education for nearly 10 years, taking her current role as curator with the de Morgan Foundation in April 2018, when she curated the touring exhibition Sublime Symmetry, which will open in its 6th venue in Liverpool at the end of 2021. Sarah is currently working with Townley Hall in Burnley on the exhibition Artist of Hope, which aligns Evelyn de Morgan's symbolic war pictures with our experiences of living through the current pandemic. At the end of the talk, there will be an opportunity to put your questions to Sarah, but I'd ask you to do that by throughout the talk or at the end to put those into the chat, and I'll then read and put them to Sarah at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to so many of you for showing up this evening and for coming along to listen. We're at 311 at the moment, which is mind-blowing, really. It's the most that I've had on any Zoom call that I've done. Just a shame I can't see you all in person and kind of get that reaction, but we do our best. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that lovely introduction, and for Claudia for organising the whole event tonight, which I know is a lot of work to put these things together. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour this evening, ladies and gentlemen, as I go through the de Morgan's connections to Leighton House, both as a studio home for the artist Frederick Lord Leighton and, as Daniel has indicated, in its more current history as a museum. I'll give a brief overview of the artwork of Evelyn and William de Morgan. I'll talk to you about Mrs. Sterling and the de Morgan collection and how the foundation, the de Morgan Foundation, the charity itself, was put together to be the steward of that collection, which is still how we operate today. I'll give a very brief introduction to Leighton House. I'm expecting a certain level of knowledge from the audience we've got this evening as to what Leighton House is and where it is and that sort of thing. So it's a very specific look at Leighton House so that we can set that up to see how William and Evelyn de Morgan's artwork was sort of involved with it. That will largely be on William's commission for the installation of Leighton's collection of tiles into the Arab Hall. I'll talk to you briefly about a fascinating woman really called Emily Russell Barrington, whose name might be familiar as she was one of Leighton's biographers and also a biographer of G.F. Watts, another esteemed Victorian artist. She actually also wrote a biography of William de Morgan. Unfortunately, this remains unpublished in the Foundation's archive. So I'm one of the few people who's had the sort of rare chance to read that, which is a lot of the talk is made up on that. It was through Russell Barrington that Evelyn de Morgan certainly was introduced to the Holland Park Circle. I'll tell you briefly about the 1902 and 1919 exhibitions of Evelyn de Morgan's artwork held at Leighton House. And then, as Daniel says, we'll get on to sort of the controversy of the Spencer Pickering bequest, 19 oil paintings by Evelyn de Morgan, which were bequeathed by her younger brother Spencer to Leighton House, but are now in the Foundation's collection. So I'll tell you what went on there. And then we'll finish with looking at Ida Perrin and the Bushey Heath Pottery before I tell you a little bit more about the relationship between de Morgan and Leighton today. Evelyn de Morgan was born in London in 1855 to well-off parents. Her mother was a descendant of the Cook of Norfolk, who has Holcombe Hall in Norfolk, and she actually hailed from Cannon Hall in Barnsley, where she was one of 4 children. She eventually moved to London and married Evelyn's father, Andre Percival Pickering QC, and Evelyn was the eldest of their 4 children. Here she is in about 1900. She was quite a precocious child, and fortunately for her, the 2 siblings that followed her were male, and this meant that since they were having a fascinating and fabulous and probably quite expensive education at home, I think the parents' opinion was, well, Evelyn might as well sit in on these lessons as well. So her handwriting from a very young age is, it's beautiful copperplate writing. She could speak 4 languages, and she had quite a brilliant understanding of a wide range of subjects, including the classics, mythology, and they had a pastor who visited the house to teach them in Christianity with the same regularity that their tutors did. And you're looking here at some of her juvenile poetry that was written between the ages of 10 and 13, which exist in the Foundation's collection. They're quite big ideas for such a young girl, and I think it really shows that her ideas extended beyond herself and beyond this world in some way. Many of the poems feature ideas about the continuation of the human soul through spirituality. I think we have to remember that death was ever so present in Victorian society. But her leitmotif of the angel of death, the title of one of these poems, comes through a lot in her later artwork as spirituality and spiritualism, and the idea of contacting spirits through mediumship is something that comes to her later in life. And here's a beautiful painting of hers from 1880 called The Angel of Death, where we can see that this woman's life on the physical earth is being left behind. It's covered in these sort of prickly thistles, whereas the spring flowers, this idea of rebirth, regeneration of the human soul, are actually on the side of the angel of death in this beautiful Italianate landscape. So that shows you her idea of sort of doing well on earth and progressing the human soul to emancipation, to live in this beautiful utopia that we see. I mentioned her mother was one of 4 children. One of those other children was John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, an esteemed 2nd generation pre-Raphaelite painter, a colleague of Burne-Jones, particularly in the aesthetic movement style. And this painting of his, The Women of Sorrento, drawing up boats from the 1870s, is absolutely typical of the aesthetic movement style. We see it's a picture that captures light and movement and fabric much more than it has any actual subject matter, when you consider the main drama of the piece should be the boat that is being pulled in, and that doesn't even make it into the picture frame. In fact, the rope that's being pulled on is actually very slack compared to the arrangement of the figures, showing his interest was in beauty itself. Such was the key of the aesthetic movement. I think Evelyn was incredibly lucky that her uncle was already an artist by the time she decided she wanted to be one, because becoming an artist simply wasn't the done thing for a woman at this time. And actually she had to go against the grain, not just of her gender, but of her social class, in order to forge ahead with quite a physical, dirty, smelly career as a female artist. But she did just that. And I think, as I've said, much of it was under the guidance of her uncle. Fortuitously for her, Spencer Stanhope moved to Florence. He moved to Italy in 1873, first of all taking a lease on a huge villa in Belloscardo, just outside Florence, which he eventually bought, and Evelyn was a regular visitor there. Again, astonishing for a young woman in her 20s, but she would travel to France and Italy alone, taking in the art and culture that she saw. And in particular, it was the work of Botticelli that she saw in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, which really ignited her passion in art. And you can see here an early watercolour copy by De Morgan on the left of Botticelli's Birth of Venus on the right-hand side, which you probably would have made and painted firsthand. It's quite a popular thing for artists to make copies of Renaissance paintings when they went on tours, and brought those back to this country during the Victorian period. So there's Evelyn's attempt there. And again, another copy after a Botticelli painting, this time Primavera. So a lovely one to look at this time of year, as we see the personification there of the springtime coming in and bringing the blooms of flowers with her, as she does. After sort of her travel and her, I think, commitment to becoming an artist, her parents were eventually on board. In her biography of her sister, Wilhelmina Sterling, who we'll focus on a little bit later, so berates her parents for their disinterest in encouraging the young Evelyn to become an artist. But actually, her father paid for her to have a drawing tutor, up to potentially 3 different drawing tutors, and ultimately permitted her to study, first of all, at the South Kensington Art Training School and then at the Slade School of Art. She soon progressed to be recognised amongst the sort of the premier student of her time. She won a full scholarship in 1874, which gave her £50 a year stipend and allowed her access to additional classes such as anatomy, which really come through in her life drawing. And what you're looking at here is a silver medal she was awarded for her drawings from life. So she won, she's got lots of accolades from different Slade prizes to her name. And when we start to look at her artwork in this context, it becomes very obvious that she was certainly worthy of these awards and these accolades. It's around this time at the Slade, sort of in 1874, that she started using her middle name Evelyn rather than her Christian name, which was Mary. We think probably because of its unisex nature, if you think of Evelyn Waugh. Rather by dropping the Mary, I mean, we'll never know, but it seems that maybe she was able to progress higher and more readily than the rest of her female counterparts because of that male association with her name. But it certainly is interesting to note. So we're looking here at some of her studies in pastel of different faces. When we see the range of paintings and the breadth of paintings that she made, it's quite astonishing really to think that each tiny detail would be rendered by the artist in pastel in this way, particularly these sort of full worked up portraits effectively for each face that she put into her painting, even if that's these wonderful sort of choir of 13 angels. Pastel studies exist for most of the individual heads. So an artist who really had a strong work ethic, and actually her diary from 1872 shows that she's very concerned with work and with wasting time. They're 2 of her chief concerns in making her artwork. Drawing from the nude was something that was quite revolutionary for women to be able to do, and it was fortuitous that Evelyn was able to attend the Slade and have that opportunity to draw from life. But despite that, she was only allowed to do so until 5 p.m, and women only taking evening classes at the Slade were not allowed to enter the life rooms at all. So even though the Slade was forward thinking, it just shows you how taboo drawing from a nude figure was in the Victorian period. Again, she excelled at it, and we see some of her fabulous drawings from life there. The one in the middle is the earliest one. You can just see a name and a date on it. The date of that is 1874, so the same year she won the medal. Oh, terrible reproductions. I do apologise for that. I hadn't realised when I was putting them together in PowerPoint. But one of the other awards that Evelyn won quite regularly at the Slade was for her compositional work. And whilst we do get a sense of that in the paintings, of course, I think looking at her studies, particularly her beautiful gold drawings on dark pigment, show off her real competence at putting a picture together and considering both the positive space, the figures and the details that she puts into those, and the negative space, so the skies and the area around the figures. There's a wonderful sense of balance that she achieves in her paintings. And I think particularly if we look at the drawing on the left, there's a wonderful diagonal that goes through that drawing, and you'll see that diagonal arrangement in many of her paintings if you start watching for it as we go through. And then the painting on the right hand side, there's actually a cross composition, which is very clever for a landscape, and it really allows to give a sense of movement and depth to the overall composition. So her paintings are beautiful as well. They really do fit into that sort of aesthetic movement revisiting of classicism that was around in the 1870s that artists like Leighton were real proponents of. She was instantly commercially successful. Her painting on the left-hand side there actually was sold to one of Leighton's friends, Sir Charles Dilke, a Liberal MP, Cadmus and Harmonia, and he had that in his collection until his death when it came back to the De Morgan Foundation. So she was an artist who was exhibiting, who was popular, and who was commercially successful from the very young age of 20 when she started exhibiting, which is fabulous, really. You'll notice in these compositions really strong ties to the Renaissance paintings we looked at the beginning, and of course her competence at handling the human figure is absolutely obvious in these early pictures. Particularly as we look at the one on the left, we can see the influence of Botticelli, a mystical artist who was considered by some in this period, and these floating figures really give way to that. Oscar Wilde saw this painting when it was exhibited at the Avant-Garde Grosvenor Gallery and credited it for its beauty, so it shows it really to be a central piece in that aesthetic movement. And on the right-hand side, we have Phosphorus and Hesperus. Again, her rigorous understanding of the human form and ability to transfer that into this wonderfully rendered two-dimensional composition is absolute in that painting. This one's an interesting picture of hers from 1883. That was the same year she was introduced to William de Morgan. She actually met William at Walter Bagehot's fancy dress party, Walter Bagehot being the brother-in-law of Emily Russell Barrington, who I've already said, you know, so much of this lecture is based on her unpublished biography of William de Morgan. Supposedly, the de Morgans met when Evelyn was wearing a costume dressed up as a tube of rose madder pigment paint, to which William quipped he was madder still. And after a long engagement, they were married in 1887 in what is reported by all concerned to be an absolute marriage based on love and a really strong match of personalities. And this painting that's painted from the year that she met William alludes to this long-lasting love, as we see again Evelyn's, this motif that she returned to time and time again of the angel of death leading an old woman to the eternal waters just beneath her here, whereas in the foreground we have these young lovers listening to the beautiful pipes being painted them by this Cupidesque figure. And the idea there is that actually even in the young throes of love there's always an omnipresence of that coming to an end with death. So this is maybe her idea of her looking forward and being afraid that this love that she had for William was so phenomenal that already she's worried about the time that she doesn't have that anymore. Following on from these sort of early aesthetic movement pictures, De Morgan became more interested in spiritualism. And even though this is based on Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, that book actually picks up a lot on spiritualism if you think about the difference between a mortal and an immortal soul. That was the part of the story that really appealed to De Morgan, but to date means we've got these wonderful mermaids, which are ever so popular in the collection. A bit later on than that, so 10 years later than the mermaids, we get her painting Flora. From the 1890s, the De Morgans were spending winters in Florence, so they were there quite a lot. And this picture celebrates the city that the goddess Flora is named after. So it's a painting that celebrates spring and all of that sort of wonderful Renaissance painting that we looked at the beginning. This is probably her best known picture and is often considered her masterpiece. After the turn of the century, De Morgan starts to paint interiors a lot more. She had tackled interiors previously, but they become sort of quite richly detailed and almost quite pre-Raphaelite in style, which I always think is quite interesting, particularly in this painting, which takes as its model and muse Jane Morris. Of course, we think of her as being this full-lipped, young, raven-haired sort of sex symbol, really, as she was depicted by Rossetti in the 1860s and 70s. But Evelyn de Morgan knew Jane Morris, and she chose to paint her at the end of her life. You see this wonderful little wisp of grey hair just under her crown. And I kind of get the sense that this painting could be forging the idea that perhaps there was something archaic in pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood art, and that time, you see the hourglass here, is destroying that beauty and that sort of ideal of the objectified woman. And instead we're asked to look to her for her sort of intellectual ideals and look into her soul rather than the wealth she has around her. As we see, that's going to be the important thing as this angelic figure comes to take her away. Certainly following on from that, it becomes less of the pre-Raphaelite style and more of De Morgan's own real visual symbolism that is part of her later series of paintings, particularly those made in response to the First World War, which she painted between 1914 and 1916. These are really richly detailed in the symbolism. So we have the dragons here underneath the figure of peace in her painting SOS. She leans forward towards this rainbow, obviously indicative of hope and the hope of peaceful days ahead outside of this demonic war that she was living through. And again, very obviously, the Red Cross, the picture of Christ there surrounded by a choir of angels collecting up the human souls, indicated by the rainbow swirls as he flies over this wasteland. You can just probably make out that this is a battleground on fire, and we have here the unmarked graves of unknown soldiers in the foreground. So she was an artist who was very politically engaged and used her artwork to submit her own kind of moral propaganda to those who were looking at it in exhibitions and buying it. Probably one of her latest pictures is Daughters of the Mist, and here we have the mermaids from the previous picture as spirits of the sky who are taking the soul of their departed sister, the little mermaid, who sort of very sadly in the end of that Hans Christian Andersen tale actually takes her own life. And here her soul ascends to everlasting life there. So I mentioned William already, and here he is in a portrait of him by his wife, painted in 1909, now in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. You see him here clutching a lustreware vase of which he's looking particularly proud, and that actually takes up sort of quite a lot of the foreground. And I think that just goes to show that both Evelyn and William were keen that his legacy was best remembered for his ceramic ware, because actually in 1909, at the time of this picture, and particularly, you know, well after his death up into the 1920s and 30s, it was these novels here on the shelf behind him, you can just see, that actually made him famous. Most of his obituaries mention him as an author and a writer, and very few actually mention the ceramics at all. Such was the fact that they'd just gone out of fashion so much by his death. But here they are immortalised by his wife Evelyn in this lovely picture. And you can just make out on the wall here that it actually says Chelsea 1909 on a plaque behind his shoulder. So the De Morgans lived very close to Leighton House in Chelsea, as Leighton House is in Holland Park. So again, you get a sense of that sort of artistic hubs that were around in London in the Victorian period. De Morgan was older than Evelyn, who was born in 1839 in London. His father, Augustus de Morgan, a mathematician, first professor of mathematics at University College London, a position which he took when he was just 21 years old. And on the right-hand side, we see William de Morgan's mother, Sophia, who was a social reform campaigner and part of Elizabeth Fry's circle. She campaigned for the abolition of slavery. She was anti-vivisection and campaigned tirelessly for women's rights. So a real sort of liberal thinker, very sort of forward-looking. She was also a spiritualist medium. So that's, I think, part of the reason why Evelyn's paintings really gain a spiritual meaning to them in the later period after she's met William, as I think her and Sophia were able to discuss those spiritualist works. William de Morgan actually had a traditional art education, first of all at Carey's Drawing School in Bloomsbury, and later at the Royal Academy Schools, which he attended from 1859 to 1863. And the painting on the right-hand side is the only picture he actually ever submitted to the Royal Academy's summer exhibition, a portrait of a girl. As far as I can find, it didn't receive any critical reception at all. So it was perhaps for that reason that around this time he abandoned his fine art career and decided instead to, well, he was sort of pulled, I think, towards these three characters. Henry Holiday in the middle was a colleague of his at the Royal Academy Schools, and it was through Holiday that he met Burne-Jones and Morris, and really his career at that point took a turn towards craft. This began with him designing panels for furniture and working on watercolours, which he was actually a bit more successful at than he had been with the oils, receiving generous reviews in the popular press for his watercolours that he submitted to Dudley Gallery exhibitions. But it was from his stained glass that he, in his own words, made more money on than he ever did since. So this was a much more lucrative career for him than the potteries ever were, which again is mind-blowing to us looking at this in 2021. But his stained glass was really beautiful. He worked for Morris & Co, designing pieces of glass for churches and for private commissions through Morris & Co. But he also worked independently and for a firm called Powell & Sons. He shared accommodation with James Tennant Lyon at 40 Fitzroy Square, and also we think had a lot in common with Lyon and shared stained glass designs and ideas with him. And here are some examples of his stained glass work. We have Christ here on the right hand side, and then in the middle it's the story of the prodigal son, and on the right hand side this is a design featuring Saint Michael. And in it you can see St. Michael slaying the dragon, of course, which he's known for. But I think this gruesome creature is one that it probably starts to give a hint of what was to come for anyone who's very familiar with De Morgan ceramics. It is his kind of quite comical and characterful animals, which he is very well known for. During the stained glass process, De Morgan noticed that if the silver nitrate solution used to make yellow stained glass was fired at sort of a critical temperature and the kiln was somehow starved of oxygen, instead of achieving a stain, you would actually end up with an opaque iridescence on the surface of the ceramic. Now, this reminded him of lusterware that he had seen in various different collections. And here we have some early examples. You can see there some Syrian 13th century and 11th century pieces. These are now in the collection of the British Museum. And De Morgan thought about this in relation to the stained glass he was misfiring and thought there must be something of a connection there. And this really is what led him to turn to ceramics, which he did 10 years after starting his career working on stained glass. And that is when he set up his potteries in Chelsea. He had been working, like I said, in Fitzroy Square. Inevitably, through making his own kilns in the basement, he managed to set his rented accommodation on fire, and so did what anyone would do and moved back in with mum. He lived on Cheney Row in Chelsea and had kilns at the bottom of the garden before eventually getting Orange House on the end of Cheney Row. And it was really this drive to perfect lustre glazing that kept him there. His early designs feature sort of these wonderful medieval galleons, and as I've said, these fantasy creatures that you can see around the fireplace here. This fireplace was in Lewis Carroll's rooms when he was a mathematics don at Christ Church College in Oxford. They have now, or since, been made into a fire screen, which is part of the senior common room at Christ Church, so that does still exist. And the top panel here shows in detail this beautiful ruby and gold lustre colour that he was able to produce from as early as 1886. He went on to perfect this technique and is absolutely well known for it. It's a really complex chemical process to create lustre, in which copper, the ruby colour that we see here, or silver, the gold, oxide is painted onto a ceramic surface that's already been fired. And the heat of the kiln, in a kiln starved of oxygen known as a muffle kiln, will actually cause a chemical reaction between the metallic oxide on the ceramic surface and the carbon monoxide in the air, in which the oxygen is removed from the metallic glaze to leave just a thin film of metal, and it's that gives this wonderful iridescence and metallic look to the ceramic. So a very complex process, but that was what I think really excited De Morgan. He was well known by his friends to be as being an inventor primarily before he was a designer. He really took lustreware to the extreme and is most famed for his Moonlight and Sunset suite, in which he was able to dilute the silver nitrates with a cobalt to give the wonderful blue and silver colours to his designs, which no one had really ever used lustre in that way before, and he is still today well known for his lustre processes. Another sort of preoccupation of De Morgan's at the potteries was to create the beautiful Persian colours, particularly Iznik tiles that he was interested in. Iznik was is a town in Turkey, and in the 15th century it was a chief producer of Persian ware ceramics, these beautiful blue and turquoise colours with a hint of red in them. And De Morgan again perfected this through his constant experiments with different types of glaze. And here we look at one of his kind of really typical Persian designs, with this wonderful rotational symmetry around the edge of the plate. And this is actually the reverse of the same plate. He was interested in ceramic form from the Middle East as well. And actually, you can't really tell in the photograph, but this is a sticky up boss, if you will, that's in the, upside down at the bottom of the plate there, and it's actually a rice dish, so it has this boss so that the rice stays fluffy, because this is filled with cold air compared with the rice on top of it. But it was the shape that De Morgan was actually interested in. The use of the plate wasn't important, because these were only ever decorative objects. I've mentioned that the De Morgans spent a lot of time living in Florence. And from winter 1890 to 1914, they spent every winter in Florence to escape the London weather, and that was chiefly for William's health, but it also introduced them to Italian art and culture, and they were able to create there. This is an example of one of De Morgan's designs, which still exists in the collection of the V&A today, and it was one of the designs he made in Florence and posted back to London to his ceramic potteries there, so that his business partner and his staff could continue to make designs to his specification even whilst he wasn't there. So they continued the De Morgan design and ensuring it was handmade despite their captain being so far away. So quite an ingenious method of communication that was used, and you can just probably make out his handwritten notes to his business partner scrolled onto this piece of paper. His designs became really exciting once he'd moved out of Chelsea. He remained there from 1872 to 1882 before taking premises at Merton Abbey nearby William Morris's works out there. And I think that just meant that the two of them had quite an idealistic way of working, with Morris on one side of the Wandle and De Morgan on the other, and all these brilliant artisan craftsmen working their designs up into tapestries and pieces of stained glass in Morris's case, and into these wonderful ceramic forms in De Morgan's. This allowed De Morgan the space, freedom, and capacity in terms of the number of staff he had to be able to make ceramic forms to take his decoration. And it's in the Merton period we see a real change, that he produces sort of these wonderfully shaped ceramics that still have this incredible decoration on them. So he's starting to think about the whole piece, not just the decoration or the chemistry inside the glaze. De Morgan had a number of brilliant commissions, and of course I'll come on to one of his first commissions, which was the Arab Hall at Leighton House. But subsequent to that, he was employed by P&O, so the cruise liners that we all still know today, to create interior schemes for 12 of their ships. Sadly, 6 of those were broken up and 6 were sunk, unbelievably. So none of them exist today. But he would make spares so that when the ships came back into port, if any repairs needed to be made, then they could be added quite quickly. And they also made examples for the showroom. So thank goodness some examples of this amazing output of De Morgan & Co. do exist, and happily the Malta Galleon tile panel came back into the Foundations collection in 2006. One of the last great commissions of De Morgan & Co. before the business folded in 1907 was Debenham House, which was designed by the architect Halsey Ricardo, who'd been De Morgan's business partner for 10 years. I think what Ricardo was trying to do was use up stock tiles because he just gave so many to Debenham House. Now this is at number 8 Addison Road, so next time you're able to go to Leighton House, if you just nip out and around the corner, you can see this wonderful blue exterior poking up over the fence. It's not open to the public, it's a private residence, but you can see these wonderful tiles. They're actually Daltons of Lambeth on the exterior, but if you peep over the fence, then you can see them. And here you can see the sort of the tiles that Ricardo would use to decorate the interior of Debenham House. So that was the kind of the stunning, opulent interior that could be achieved from the use of these tiles. Here is Wilhelmina Sterling. She was Evelyn de Morgan's younger sister by 10 years, and it's thanks to her that we have so much in the de Morgan collection. Of the 100 or so known paintings by Evelyn de Morgan, the foundation has 56, and we also have nearly 2,000 pieces of ceramic and a huge archive of drawings as well. You can see her here sitting at a table surrounded by beautiful de Morgan ceramics and some of her sister's pictures behind her there. This picture was taken clearly when she was quite late on in years, and she actually lived to be 99. So how on earth did she manage to collect such a huge volume of de Morgan? Well, we'll tell you. She was married to her husband, Charles Goodbairn Sterling, who was a lawyer in the 1920s, and the two of them really did have a passion for collecting. It wasn't just de Morgan ceramics. They collected a lot of pre-Raphaelite art and were quite interested in medieval furniture as well, and furnished their house at Launceston Place, where they're standing here, with all of their wonderful arts and treasures. The first piece of de Morgan we think the Sterlings owned was this leopard dish, which was given by William de Morgan to them as a wedding present, and we get some of the sort of brilliant quirkiness of de Morgan's animals in this piece as the leopard, rather than chasing the antelope, is simply sort of tapping it on the back. So these wonderful human characteristics in his animals, which make them so comical. Here is the house at Launceston Place, which the Sterlings lived at, surrounded by their ever-growing collection of de Morgan until 1931, and you can just see hints of some of their treasures here, the wide range of things that they collected, and they soon outgrew it. But what a house that was sort of made for the collection really was Old Battersea House, so just by Battersea Park, south of the river. This 16-bedroom Georgian townhouse. Somehow Wilhelmina Sterling managed to persuade what was then Battersea Council to give this house to her on a peppercorn rent, on the proviso that she would allow members of the public to come and visit her collection in the house, and she did that until her death at the age of 99. Now, unfortunately, she never owned the house due to that arrangement, which means that the collection, if you want to think of it in that way, has always been homeless. So the De Morgan Foundation today owns a collection, and we display that in partnership with other museums and galleries across the country to make sure that people can visit it and see it. She was really astute at collections management and kept records, detailed records of the pictures and pottery that she had in her collection by making various and regular inventories as the collection grew. These start to get a bit confused in her later years, but it's an incredible thing for a collection manager today to have, is records of things coming into the collection. So not too far away from Old Battersea House, we have Leighton House, and with everything about the De Morgans and the Foundation's collection in our minds, let's go forward and look for the links between this amazing artistic family and Leighton House itself. So here we have the original part of the building in the middle, the Arab Hall extension on the left, and the 1920s extension on the right-hand side there, just to give you a very brief rundown of the three elements of the house. It was built as the studio home to Frederick Lord Leighton, and here he is painted with all of his honours bestowed upon him, really. So the chain he had as president of the Royal Academy, he's wearing his Oxford robes that indicate the professorship he was granted, an honorary professorship, and behind him we see a section of his painting of the Parthenon frieze. So he was a painter of great classical subjects, an artist at the height of his career, and his studio home absolutely was built to reflect that. So most of the top floor, for anyone who's been to Leighton House Museum today, is preserved as the artist's studio, so you get a sense of the scale and the grandeur. Double aspect window to let the light flood in is absolutely essential for an artist, and all these key elements made up his home. It was a house that was supposed to show off the collection, so even though it wasn't a museum per se in Leighton's time, it was certainly somewhere that people would come to admire the great master at work or with his work, and Leighton held regular open houses and was something really of the celebrity in his own time. The picture on the right-hand side here shows another portion of the house where artwork, not just of Leighton's, but gifts that were given to him by his contemporary artists, were also shown on display in the house. It's a house very much of contradictions, really, much as Leighton's personality was. And on the left-hand side, we see that compared to the very grand studio and public rooms, the house actually has some quite modest areas, particularly Leighton's bedroom, which is tiny and just has this single bed frame in it. So as well as the very sort of public Leighton, who was quite show-offy, we have a very private man who liked to keep some of himself back from public view. Arguably the most impressive portion of the house is the Arab Hall extension, which was begun in 1877 by Leighton's preferred architect, George Aitchison, who was something of a friend of Leighton's as well. I already mentioned the Liberal politician Charles Dilke in relation to one of Evelyn de Morgan's paintings. He owned it. He was also a friend of Aitchison and Leighton, so it starts to show you that within the elite classes there were a lot of interconnections and a lot of people who knew each other, and it was maybe through these connections that de Morgan was given the commission to install all of those tiles into the Arab Hall. Aitchison might have known of de Morgan's work from a previous commission he'd worked on, which was Princess Gate and Gardens up in Kensington, just by Kensington Gardens, which was built and developed in the 1850s by C.J. Freak, the builder. These properties were soon bought by the Nouveau Riche, and particularly number 49 Princess Gate might ring a bell to fans of the aesthetic movement, because that is where Whistler's Peacock Room was. It was commissioned by the shipping magnate Frederick Leyland, and is now actually in Washington, D.C. in a museum there, because it was picked up and moved, but here's a picture of it. And so you can start to see that even though these homes looked quite plain on the outside, the insides of them had this sort of boudoir effect, and this was definitely of fashion. Even though Aitchison didn't work on this property, just next door at number 52 Princess Gardens, another shipping magnate, this time Thomas Eustace Smith, employed Aitchison to redevelop the interiors of his Princess Gate home, and the fireplaces were filled with De Morgan tiles. So De Morgan and Co had only really been in production for about 5 years when these tiles were installed. But even so, you can see that something in the lustreware obviously appealed, and these De Morgan fireplaces would have sort of reflected a beautiful glittering light when lit, and really must have had quite a stunning effect because, like I said, De Morgan was employed to fit Leighton's collection. Another sort of connection that might have led Leighton and Aitchison to select De Morgan to look after the tile scheme of the Arab Hall could have been Emily Russell Barrington. As I mentioned, she was Leighton's biographer and also wrote a biography of William de Morgan. It features a lot of her friendship with Evelyn de Morgan as well. She'd known William de Morgan since 1873. Sorry, I forgot this slide was in here. This is one of her own paintings. So as well as being a wonderful writer and biographer, she was also an artist. And this painting is actually in Leighton House's collection, Portrait of a Girl. So you can see it sort of very much fits in with that beautiful opulent aesthetic style and colour scheme we've been looking at. But she met de Morgan when he lived at Cheney Row, when she went to visit his potteries to buy tiles with her friend Octavia Hill. Octavia Hill's a social reform campaigner who was quite interested in bettering the lives of those living in the Victorian slums, and had enlisted the help of John Ruskin to design a square for her near Marylebone, which would provide a public space and a respite for workers. And she wanted some jolly tiles to brighten the place up. And so went to see de Morgan with her friend Emily Russell Barrington. And that's when Russell Barrington first met de Morgan and was introduced to him. There's a renumbering of the street in de Morgan's own time. It's now number 30. And if you look on Rightmove, you can have a real good nosy around the interiors of it. Here's the dining room, and here's a garden. So you can start to see sort of how big the garden was and how that might well have accommodated the lustre kilns de Morgan was building in it in the 1870s. Russell Barrington owned a great number of artworks by both William and Evelyn, and in particular she credited or loved a piece of art that she had by him which featured some doves. She'd recounted seeing them flying around in a tree in her garden to de Morgan, and he'd painted that for her and presented her with it, which is a rather charming story, and I think shows the real closeness of their friendship. So through one of these routes, de Morgan was asked to install the tiles. And I think it must have been such an overwhelming task, basically like putting a jigsaw together that you don't have all the pieces for onto a table it's not going to fit onto. The tiles were collected completely independently by Leighton and Sir Caspar Purdon-Clarke, who was the director of the V&A Museum, and someone called Richard Burton, on their trips through the Middle East, and brought back as a collection. They were never intended to be installed and displayed until the Arab Hall was envisaged, and of course Aitchison was building a building without too much consideration of the interior. So a mammoth task for De Morgan. It was one that he spent way too much time and energy overthinking. The inventive side of him was desperate to understand the coloured glazes and to perfect these, and to really understand how the craftsmen that had gone 500 years before him had produced ceramic designs. And this really led him to spending a lot more time on the commission than he ever got paid by Leighton for doing it. When he first saw the tiles, they were supposedly stacked up in the back garden of Leighton House in huge piles. And Russell Barrington recalls sort of De Morgan's astonishment as he walked round them all, picking up samples and just being completely enticed by these wonderful colours that he saw. These images that you can see here show his working process towards filling in the blanks, and how he did that, and how he really wanted to obtain an astute understanding of the geometry that underpins some of these Persian and Islamic designs. So here we have the original tiles installed in Leighton House. This is standing in the Arab Hall looking back towards the staircase. And you can see it's quite clearly made up of 2 tiles in this repeat pattern. What De Morgan then did is sketch this out, and someone at the V&A has had it the wrong way when they numbered it, which is why it's got an upside down 135 on it. This drawing is in the collection of the V&A. And from his drawing, he then turned this into his own tile scheme, which relies on a 4 tile repeat rather than a 2 tile repeat. So you can see here that it wasn't just the tiles themselves and his interest in putting those together that really got got him excited. It was how he could then maybe better or change the arrangement of them and put that into his own designs as well. So constantly thinking of new ways to perfect his design processes. So the Arab Hall extension was finished and is superb, and as soon as the museum reopens, I urge you to visit if you haven't already, and just go again if you have. It wasn't long after Leighton's death that his 2 sisters were put in charge of the house, and the house and its contents were, well, the house was left to them, the contents were sold off, but they were, I think, quite keen quite early after Leighton's death to start holding exhibitions there and to open the site as a museum. One of the first exhibitions that they must have had in 1902 was an exhibition of Evelyn de Morgan's paintings. And from what I can gather, Russell Barrington had something to do with this as well. There's very little evidence that exists for exactly the journey that the paintings in the 1902 exhibition took, and that's largely because, as you can see from this flyer, they were exhibited in Berlin, Dusseldorf and Cologne before they came to Leighton House. And newspaper archive records just aren't as good in Germany, and my German isn't existent, so I haven't been able to fully search any resources that might lead us to understand that. But what it seems that happened is one of De Morgan's paintings, as you can see from this newspaper article, Victory, or a painting we know as Victoria Dolorosa, was exhibited at Leighton House independently of other pictures which then later came to join it. And here we have Victoria Dolorosa, so the idea that there's never sort of a true victory, or that there's always desperate sadness in victory. And even though we have a soldier here being crowned, it's, as you can see, this figure of an angel of death type figure again, so reminding us that even in victory, whenever there's war, that always comes at this huge cost to human life. So quite a an interesting painting, painted in 1902, as we know, as the Boer Wars were coming to a close. So definitely a comment on that war, which many opposed, particularly the liberally minded, and many artists opposed the Boer Wars as well. So I mentioned that Leighton House was very much built to be somewhere that showed off pictures, and here we have an image of some of Leighton's own works on an open house he held on a Sunday just before the Royal Academy summer exhibition. And what he would do was show off his paintings to the public that were going to be submitted to the Royal Academy summer exhibition that year. But this gives us a sort of sense of how paintings might have been displayed in Leighton House when De Morgan's own paintings came to them, because they were some quite large pieces that were exhibited there. I've tried to put them on the slide in the order that they kind of physically are compared to each other. We have on the left the Storm Spirits from 1900. The Grey Sisters in the middle is the biggest of the three, that's 1881. And from 1897, Blindness and Cupidity Chase Joy from the City is the smallest of the three. And these were just three more paintings that joined Victoria Dolorosa during that 1902 exhibition. You can see that their paintings, which are full of life and colour. I mentioned De Morgan's compositions and how intellectual and well planned they were at the beginning of this talk. You can start to see those here, particularly I think in this one, which we have the figure of blindness, that spiritual blindness, and cupidity, the worship of material wealth, chasing joy from the city. So the idea being, if you focus too much on closing your eyes to spirituality and having lots of money, you can say goodbye to your spirituality, and there she is flying out of the city. But you have that wonderful upward ascension and these great big city walls that kind of indicate once she's gone, she's not coming back. And that's the real intelligent side of De Morgan's picture making. De Morgan in her will, so when William passed away first in 1917 and left everything to his wife Evelyn. In her will, she left all the pictures that were in her studio, aside from some named ones which she left to her sister Wilhelmina, who we've met, and to her brother Spencer, who we will meet. She left the pictures in her studio to be sold to benefit St Dunstan's Hostel for blinded soldiers and sailors in Regent's Park. Today that's a charity called Blind Veterans UK, and I've gone through their archives quite extensively, and it looks as though no such sale at Messrs Christie's, Manson and Wood was ever held of her studio paintings. What it seems that happened is that her brother Spencer Pickering took the pick of the paintings in her studio for himself and made a donation to St Dunstan's. There were then supposedly some refuse pictures, according to her brother, that he did leave to St Dunstan's, and they were sent to the charity for them to do with whatever they want. So these were paintings by De Morgan that he didn't consider to be any good, and unbelievably, that included this, something I would consider a masterpiece, the Gilded Cage, this wonderful painting of a woman in a loveless marriage looking longingly at the party going on outside her window, and the metaphor of her being like a trapped canary in a gilded cage. So it's a painting that gets requested for loan quite a lot. It's a beautiful example of De Morgan's work, but according to her brother Spencer, it was one of these refuse pictures. Now, Wilhelmina Sterling actively fought to sort of amass the biggest collection she could of De Morgan artwork. She was absolutely compelled to care for and share her brother-in-law and sister's artwork with the world. And so she drove up to Regent's Park to St Dunstan's and took from them the pictures that had been considered refuse by Spencer Pickering and gave them a cheque for the money due. When Spencer heard about this, he actually demanded that she take them back because he, as executor to the will, hadn't actually given permission for that transaction to go ahead, and he said that it was illegal. So we start to see something as a family rift between Evelyn's siblings, Spencer and Wilhelmina, who survived her. And that's when it gets interesting. So Spencer, as I've said, ended up with quite a number of Evelyn De Morgan pictures, which he'd sort of handpicked from her estate after her death, and was the legal owner of. In 1919, he sent 17 of these pictures to Leighton House for a wonderful exhibition, which was sort of on the occasion of his sister's death, to celebrate her life and work as an artist. Again, some enormous pictures came to Leighton House. Our Lady of Peace, which I've got a picture of in one of our latest exhibitions, so you can see the size of this compared to sort of an average height chap. But another beautiful picture which sort of depicts the strain of the Boer War on humanity. Port After Stormy Seas is another huge picture which came to Leighton House, and I think a brilliant one to have come to Leighton House, and to see that in the Leighton tradition, as you can see, you know, instantly that this figure is quite clearly modelled on the figures are painted onto the Parthenon, and absolutely in that classical form that Leighton so admired. But this exhibition of pictures was then sort of kept hold of by Leighton House, and Spencer Pickering, in his will, left, well, it's quite a complicated will and it's quite long, but in essence, he, as long as his wife Ethel agreed to it, he left his collection of pictures to Leighton House, provided that no later than 25 years after his death, a permanent De Morgan gallery of permanent character was not established anywhere else. And so upon his death in 1922, the pictures stayed with Leighton House, and they were some of the ones I've just shown you, Our Lady of Peace and Port After Stormy Seas, amongst others. What happened next is that Wilhelmina Sterling spent approximately 17 years desperately trying to confirm to the Charities Commission that she had in fact established a gallery of permanent character in her home at Old Battersea House, and that in fact the paintings therefore legally belonged to her under the terms of her brother's bequest. And finally, in 1937, the paintings were transferred to Old Battersea House, at first on loan and eventually by order of the Charities Commission permanently. And so these paintings came then from Leighton House to the De Morgan collection to join Wilhelmina Sterling's other refuse pictures and other paintings that she'd been buying from auctions throughout the 1920s and 1930s. So to go back to Leighton House in the 1920s, sort of after this wonderful De Morgan exhibition, I think it was 1922 that Halsey Ricardo, a name you'll remember from being William De Morgan's business partner for a time, was enlisted by someone called Ida Perrin to create this extension to Leighton House. So it's a much later extension, and I know that superb plans are afoot to redevelop that and make that a space that we can all use and enjoy, which will take some of the pressure off the historic fabric of the main building, so a cafe and some visitor toilets, and it will make the space truly accessible to all of us as well. So it's a really exciting project that's coming up. But there was a reason Ida Perrin wanted it to be Halsey Ricardo, and that is because she loved De Morgan pottery. She had a huge collection of it herself, which was left to Leighton House upon her death. But also she was so interested in De Morgan pottery and the processes he'd gone through that at her home in Bushey, sort of north of London, she enlisted two of De Morgan's most favoured staff, Fred Passenger, who we see here at the kiln in Bushey, and his brother Charles Passenger, who'd worked for De Morgan for almost 60 years together during their own lifetimes, and really could faithfully replicate De Morgan's own designs, and supposedly had had permission from De Morgan when he was alive to replicate his designs in copy on the ceramics. And they did that. They established Bushey Heath Pottery and made wonderful examples of De Morgan's designs for many years after his death, which is a wonderful legacy to have of De Morgan pottery. And the sort of legacy of that today is that when Leighton House had had the grant and had decided to go ahead and redevelop that whole Halsey Ricardo extension to the building that I previously mentioned, they did an assessment of their collection and decided that that was maybe a bit too much Bushey Heath pottery for them to be able to display, because Ida Perrin had left so much. And so very fortuitously, in a wonderful contemporary link between our two organisations and collections, we were able to acquire these two pieces of Bushey Heath for the De Morgan collection. We previously didn't have any, and we now feel really happy and able to be able to tell the story of De Morgan's legacy as a ceramicist, which is so often ignored as people just focus on what he was doing in the 19th century, but actually in the 20th century as well. There are sort of wonderful examples of his work still inspiring, and this is a wonderful addition to our collection. fast forward to even further in the future, beyond where we are today, and this is the architect's impression of the redevelopment to that extension at Leighton House, which has been kindly shared with me by Daniel. And you can see here the Leighton House collection of De Morgan pottery, which was given by Ida Perrin, will be displayed in this cafe area so that people will still be able to enjoy it. And I think I'm right in saying this hasn't been properly on display together as a collection before. So we hope this will be a firm foundation of our two organisations working together well into the future. Another fantastic example of De Morgan art, which is in Leighton House's collection, I think because it was left over after the 1919 exhibition, may be thought of as second rate because it was a drawing rather than a painting, even though I think that these gold drawings on dark paper are some of Evelyn de Morgan's finest work. But here we have it, another beautiful example of De Morgan artwork in Leighton House's collection. Just to finish on, because it's something I get asked all the time and it's not a quick answer, is where is the De Morgan Foundation based today? So I mentioned before we've been left somewhat homeless by the nature of how the foundation charity and the collection it owns was set up, but we work in partnership today with Cannon Hall in Barnsley. The keenly aware amongst you will remember I mentioned that as being Evelyn de Morgan's mother's family home, which is why we now have this connection. That's been a museum since the 1950s. With the Watts Gallery in Surrey, which I'm sure many people will have heard of, was built as the museum for the Victorian artist G.F. Watts's work, and with Whittick Manor in Wolverhampton, which is a treasure trove of arts and crafts artwork and has many De Morgan fireplaces inside the main building. So we have our own discrete gallery in the grounds at Whittick Manor. Just over an hour, so I do apologise for keeping you a little bit longer than billed, but thank you so much, and I'm very happy to hang on for a couple more minutes and take questions if people do have a couple more minutes to spare. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Sarah. I'd just like to echo that after that rocky patch, it's been great in more recent times working with the foundation, and it was great that we could share those passenger works with you and complete the collection of the foundation. There are some questions, and I'll just put those to you now. A couple have referred to the presence of the foundation in Wandsworth, and sorry to have seen it gone, and just whether you could just clarify when that happened and how that happened.
Yeah, so the foundation's collection was held in sort of a side bit of Wandsworth Museum from 2001 till 2015, with 3 years off in the middle. So it was always a bit sort of in and out, the history of that. And the short story is that Wandsworth Council decided it was no longer going to provide a museum service, and that it wanted to either have a commercial income from the space, which of course the foundation couldn't afford in rent, or to sell the building, which the foundation couldn't afford to buy. So we closed that sort of, museum permanently in 2015 and have moved to our partnership way of working, which I've just explained.
Great, thank you very much.
The artwork hasn't gone anywhere. I think people sometimes are concerned that that's in a big cupboard, but it is all still on display across the three partners.
Thanks. A question from Laura de Felice. Hello, Laura. Do we know a lot about his glass, De Morgan's glass? Do we know how many pieces he made, where they all are, and how many have survived? Did any of his works inspire Tiffany or Lafarge?
So if you're very interested in De Morgan glass, then a publication called Saints and Symbols has just come out, written by Alistair Carew-Cox and William Waters, who have published, this is their third volume of Pre-Raphaelite stained glass, and it's a huge chapter on William de Morgan's windows in that book, which is beautifully illustrated as well. So we're now up to 15 churches that we know still have De Morgan glass in them, and an extra church and private residence that did have De Morgan glass in them. So he wasn't as prolific as Burne-Jones, but certainly in that 10-year career, he made a decent number of windows. And And obviously they were in public spaces, but most of them have only very recently been attributed to De Morgan, were previously sort of known by unknown makers. So in terms of his legacy and him inspiring other artists in glass, he was just one of many artists really who were working on stained glass, particularly for Morris & Co in that period. And so I'd be quite hesitant to say yes. I think no is most likely the answer. As he was quite often a sort of secondary artist. It was really the design and making of the glass that had so inspired him. And really, you know, his name is better known because he moved on to the ceramics afterwards rather than the glass. But it's such new scholarship and research that sort of legacy of his glass hasn't really been explored yet.
Thanks. So then just a couple more. So the first is about William's relationship with the architect Norman Shaw and the Bedford Park development in Chiswick. So how De Morgan's tiles came to be part of the Tabard pub, the famous Tabard pub there.
Yeah, absolutely. So De Morgan, during that sort of early period in Chelsea in the 1870s, was known to a number of arts and crafts architects, and Norman Shaw, of course, was one of them. And he actually created 2 designs specifically on commission for Norman Shaw, which were the Bedford Park Daisy and Bedford Park Anemone, very sort of flattened, stylized, medieval looking arrangements of those flowers. And he made those in a number of different colorways. And some of the residents of Bedford Park have been incredibly generous and shared pictures of their fireplaces where they're still intact. And of course, if you go to the Tabard, you can see the wonderful parrot tile frieze that's there. And was there a second part to that question? I mean, yes is the answer. Yes, he was employed by Norman Shaw on the Bedford Park Commission.
Yeah, no, that answers it. And finally, from Vivian Fleet, I'm interested in where William De Morgan developed his interest in Iznik ceramics from. Did he travel to the Middle East as Leighton had done?
As far as I'm aware, no, but he did spend 8 weeks in Egypt in 1893 working with potters there on developing their lustre glazes, which, you know, by all accounts, he really enjoyed his time there and working with them, and that was quite you know, an exciting thing for him to be doing. But aside from that, I don't think he did. And where his appetite came from, I mean, really, I usually pin that on Leighton's commission. It came so early in his career as a ceramic artist, and as I mentioned, you know, he spent so much more time and energy on the commission than it ever made him in money. It was clearly a labour of love, and I think it was an interest in how the tiles had been made and how he would be able to replicate that was of such interest to him. And you know, those beautiful geometric designs, I think, couldn't fail to inspire anyone if they were able to work with them so closely for so long.
Wonderful, thank you very much for answering those. And just looking at the chat, there's a huge amount of positive comments, and people have clearly been fascinated, as we all have, by the last hour and these connections between De Morgan and Evelyn, between them and Leighton, and the multiple connections that there've been over the years. So thank you so much for that, and thank you, Sarah, for that presentation. And I just again echo your words and encourage everybody to come and see the new Leighton House when we complete the current project, with our reopening scheduled, we hope, for October of this year. So again, on behalf of everybody, thank you for the presentation, and thank you to the audience